What would you do if the enemy you were taught to fear for years suddenly stood before you, not with weapons, but with bread? In the devastated streets of post-war Japan, where hunger had become the cruelest master and survival meant scraping moss from stones to fill empty stomachs, something unthinkable happened. British soldiers, the same men who had fought through blood-soaked jungles and witnessed unspeakable horrors, arrived not as conquerors seeking revenge, but as human beings offering the one thing no propaganda could prepare anyone for: compassion in its purest form. Before we dive into this extraordinary true story that will challenge everything you think you know about war, humanity, and the transformative power of a simple act of kindness, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced or witnessed an act of unexpected compassion that changed your perspective forever. This isn't just another war story. This is the untold chapter that history often forgets. The moment when the lines between victor and vanquished blurred into something far more profound, when trained warriors became unexpected angels of mercy, and when starving mothers discovered that humanity could survive even the darkest chapters of human conflict. August 1945 had brought Japan to its knees. The surrender wasn't just a military defeat, it was the collapse of everything an entire generation had been taught to believe. Emperor Hirohito's voice, broadcast for the first time in history over crackling radios, had spoken the unthinkable words of capitulation. But for the women of Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and countless bombed-out cities across the archipelago, the emperor's words meant something far more immediate and terrifying than the end of imperial ambitions. It meant the arrival of the occupying forces. It meant facing the enemy they had been conditioned to fear more than death itself. For months, the propaganda machine had painted vivid nightmares of what would happen when Allied forces set foot on Japanese soil. Women were told to expect the worst imaginable treatment, that soldiers would show no mercy, that Japanese civilians would face systematic brutalization. Some families had prepared poison. Others had rehearsed desperate escape plans into the mountains. The collective fear was so profound that many chose to end their lives rather than face what they believed was inevitable horror. But there was another enemy stalking the streets of Japan, one more immediate than any occupying army: starvation. The American firebombing campaigns had reduced major cities to skeletal ruins of twisted metal and ash. Agricultural infrastructure had collapsed. Supply chains that once fed millions had disintegrated. The fishing fleets that had sustained coastal populations were destroyed or confiscated. Rice, the staple that had anchored Japanese civilization for millennia, had become more precious than gold. Government rations, when they existed at all, provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Children's ribs became visible through their skin. Elderly citizens simply sat down one day and didn't rise again. Mothers made impossible calculations about which child might have the strength to survive if given a slightly larger portion of watery soup. In the markets, when there was anything to sell, the prices were astronomical and paid in worthless currency or desperate barter. Some women traded family heirlooms for a handful of sweet potatoes. Others foraged in burned-out buildings for anything remotely edible: tree bark, wild grasses, insects, leather belts boiled into gelatinous broth. The autumn of 1945 in Japan wasn't just post-war, it was post-apocalyptic. Into this landscape of devastation and terror came the British Commonwealth Occupation Force. These weren't fresh-faced boys playing at war. These were hardened veterans of the Burma campaign, men who had fought through some of the most brutal jungle warfare in human history. They had watched their friends die of tropical diseases, malnutrition, and Japanese bullets in the suffocating heat of Southeast Asian rainforests. They had survived the infamous death railway, witnessed the aftermath of prisoner-of-war camps where their countrymen had been starved and tortured. They had every reason, every psychological justification to arrive in Japan with hearts full of vengeance. Military command had prepared them for hostile civilian populations. They were briefed on potential resistance, on the fanaticism they might encounter, on the need to maintain strict authority and distance. They were occupiers, after all, not liberators. Japan had not welcomed them. Japan had surrendered only after atomic fire had consumed 2 cities, and the Soviet Union had crashed through Manchuria like an iron wave. These British soldiers understood the complex dynamics of occupation. They knew that maintaining order would require displays of power and unwavering authority. But something unexpected happened in those first encounters between British soldiers and Japanese civilians. Something that no military manual had prepared anyone for. Something that would forever challenge the neat categories of enemy and ally, victor and vanquished, us and them. The first relief distribution was scheduled for a cool September morning in a devastated neighborhood on the outskirts of Yokohama. The logistics were military precise. Trucks loaded with tinned foods, flour, powdered milk, medical supplies, and precious sacks of rice secured through Allied channels. The distribution point was set up in what remained of a school courtyard. The building behind it a hollow shell with exposed rafters reaching toward the sky, like the ribs of some immense dead creature. Word had spread through the neighborhood in whispers. The British were coming. They were bringing food, but nobody knew what price would be demanded for it. Approximately 200 women gathered as the trucks arrived, most clutching infants or holding the hands of hollow-eyed children. Not a single man was among them. The men were dead, scattered across Pacific Islands and Chinese battlefields, or imprisoned, or so broken by defeat that they couldn't face the occupiers. These women came because their children were starving, because they had no choice, because the maternal instinct to feed one's offspring overrides even the deepest fear. They stood in ragged lines, wearing whatever clothes hadn't been sold or burned for warmth. Many wore the traditional Mompe work pants that had become standard wartime attire. Their faces were gaunt, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. They didn't speak. They barely looked up. They waited with the resigned patience of people who had learned that waiting was all they could do. The British soldiers who climbed down from those trucks saw something that no amount of combat experience had prepared them for. These weren't the faceless enemy of wartime propaganda. These were mothers. These were grandmothers holding babies who clearly weren't getting enough milk. These were children with distended bellies and stick-thin limbs, the unmistakable signs of prolonged malnutrition. One soldier, a Sergeant William Patterson from Lancashire, would later write in his diary, "I expected to feel hatred when I saw them. I expected to remember my mates who died in Burma. But all I saw were people who looked like they'd already died inside. I saw my own mum's face in every one of those women, and I thought about what she'd gone through during the Blitz. Suddenly they weren't Japanese. They were just people who'd lost everything." The commanding officer that day was Captain James Thornton, a career military man from Edinburgh who had fought in North Africa before being transferred to Southeast Asia. He was known among his men as a by-the-book officer, fair but demanding, not given to sentimentality. He stood before the assembled crowd with an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier who had volunteered for occupation duty. The silence was absolute. You could hear the wind moving through the broken buildings, the distant sound of rubble shifting, the cry of a baby quickly muffled by its mother. Captain Thornton had prepared a speech about cooperation, about following instructions, about maintaining order. But as he looked at the sea of frightened, hopeful, desperate faces before him, something in his carefully constructed military bearing cracked. He turned to the interpreter and said something that would set the tone for everything that followed. "Tell them," he said quietly, his Scottish accent thickening with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Tell them that we're here to help. Tell them that we know they're hungry. Tell them that we're going to make sure their children eat today. Tell them that nobody will be hurt. Tell them that we're just going to give them food, and that's all. No conditions, no humiliation, just food." The interpreter translated, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. For a long moment, nothing happened. The women didn't move. They didn't react. They had learned not to trust words, not to believe promises. Words had failed them too many times. Their government had promised victory and delivered annihilation. Their leaders had promised honor and delivered starvation. Why should the words of an enemy soldier mean anything at all? But then Captain Thornton did something extraordinary. He walked to the nearest truck, picked up one of the small tins of corned beef, and walked directly to the woman standing at the front of the nearest line. She was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had aged her prematurely. She held a small boy, maybe 4 years old, pressed against her hip. The child's eyes were enormous in his thin face, following the tin in the soldier's hand with the intensity of a starving animal watching prey. The woman's body went rigid. Her eyes dropped to the ground. She was trembling visibly, her entire frame shaking with fear that was almost palpable. This was the moment she had been dreading. The moment when the enemy would demand payment for food, when the nightmare scenarios whispered in darkened rooms would become reality. Captain Thornton stopped directly in front of her. The entire courtyard held its breath. Then, with slow, deliberate movements designed not to startle, he held out the tin. He didn't thrust it forward. He didn't speak. He simply offered it, his weathered hand steady, his expression gentle in a way that seemed almost impossible for a man in military uniform. "For your son," he said in English, knowing she wouldn't understand the words but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. The interpreter repeated it in Japanese. The woman stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Her mind couldn't reconcile the reality before her, with everything she had been taught to expect. This was supposed to be the monster. This was supposed to be the brutal conqueror. But the man standing before her had kind eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen too much suffering, and in his outstretched hand was food. Real food. The kind of food her son hadn't seen in over a year. Her hands rose slowly, shaking so violently she could barely control them. She took the tin, and the moment her fingers closed around it, something inside her shattered. The tears came without warning, without sound at first, just streaming down her hollow cheeks. Then a sob broke from her throat, raw and painful. The kind of crying that comes from a place deeper than simple relief. A place where grief and gratitude and disbelief and hope all tangled together into something almost unbearable. Captain Thornton's own eyes glistened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small packet of biscuits, the kind issued in British rations, and offered it to the little boy. The child looked at his mother, seeking permission, and when she nodded through her tears, he took the packet with both hands as if it were made of glass. He didn't tear it open and devour it as one might expect a starving child to do. Instead, he held it carefully, reverently, staring at it as if afraid it might disappear. The captain nodded once, then turned back to his men and gave the order to begin distribution. What happened next would be remembered by every person in that courtyard, for the rest of their lives. The British soldiers moved through the lines with their arms full of supplies, handing them out with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything about war and occupation. They smiled at children. They nodded respectfully to elderly women. They made sure the most desperate families received extra portions. There was no shouting, no shoving, no displays of dominance. They treated these former enemy civilians with the same basic dignity they would show to anyone in need. But not everyone approved of this approach. Standing at the edge of the courtyard, observing with undisguised contempt, was Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Hartwell, a British officer who had arrived as part of a supervisory detail. Hartwell was old guard military aristocracy, a man whose family had served the empire for generations, who saw the world in rigid hierarchies of superior and inferior, civilized and barbaric, victor and vanquished. He had watched the distribution begin with growing agitation, and now he could contain himself no longer. He strode into the middle of the courtyard, his boots crunching on broken concrete, his face flushed with anger. "Captain Thornton!" His voice cut through the moment like a knife. "What the devil do you think you're doing? This is not a charity bazaar. These people are the enemy. Their countrymen killed thousands of our boys. They need to understand that there are consequences to losing a war. This display of weakness is absolutely unacceptable." The women nearest to Hartwell instinctively drew back, clutching their received rations close, fear flooding back into their faces. The fragile trust that had been building shattered in an instant. Captain Thornton turned slowly to face his superior officer, and every soldier in the courtyard stopped what they were doing. The tension became electric, dangerous. "With respect, sir," Thornton said, his Scottish accent becoming more pronounced, as it always did when he was angry or emotional. "These aren't enemy soldiers. They're starving civilians. They're mothers and children. And we're British soldiers, not barbarians." Hartwell's face darkened further. "Don't you dare lecture me about being British, Captain. I was fighting for king and country when you were still in short pants. These people deserve to suffer for what their country did. They chose to follow their emperor into a war of aggression. They celebrated when our boys were dying in Japanese camps. And now you want to give them our rations with smiles and handshakes. You're making us look weak. You're undermining the entire occupation." The words hung in the air like poison. Some of the Japanese women who understood enough English began to weep again, but now from shame and renewed fear. The transformation in the courtyard's atmosphere was instant and terrible. Captain Thornton felt something rising in his chest, something that combined months of witnessing suffering with a deep, almost spiritual conviction about what it meant to be human. "No, sir," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the courtyard. "What makes us look weak is if we become like the enemy we fought against. I didn't survive Burma by becoming the kind of man who punishes children for the sins of their government. These people have already suffered. Look at them. Really look at them. They're not celebrating. They're not defiant. They're barely alive. And if we have the power to feed them and we choose not to, if we have the power to show mercy and we choose cruelty instead, then we've lost something far more important than any battle. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. You're insubordinate, Captain. I could have you court-martialed for this display. I could have your commission stripped. These people need to be reminded of their place. They need to understand that we are the conquerors and they are the conquered. There was something almost frantic in his voice. Now, something that suggested his anger came from a deeper place than simple military protocol. Sergeant Patterson, standing nearby, suddenly understood. He had heard the stories about Hartwell, stories whispered among the enlisted men. The lieutenant colonel's son had been captured by the Japanese in Singapore and had died in a prison camp. Hartwell hadn't just fought the Japanese military, he had buried his only child because of them. His hatred wasn't abstract or ideological. It was personal, intimate, and all-consuming. Captain Thornton seemed to sense this too, because his voice softened slightly, though his conviction remained unshaken. Sir, I cannot imagine the depth of your loss, and I won't pretend to. But ask yourself something. If your son could speak to you now, if he could see this moment, would he want you to punish these children because of what happened to him? Or would he want you to be the kind of man who proves that we're better than the cruelty we fought against? It was a risky gamble, invoking a dead son to a grieving father, but Thornton felt it was the only way to reach past the armor of hatred. Hartwell's face went through a series of transformations: shock, rage, anguish, confusion. His mouth opened and closed several times without sound. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly relaxed. For a moment, everyone watching thought he might break down entirely or explode into violence. Instead, he did something unexpected. He looked around. The courtyard really looked, perhaps for the first time. He saw a young mother, probably 20 years old, holding twins who both looked severely malnourished. He saw an elderly woman who reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother, her back bent, her hands gnarled with arthritis, struggling to hold onto a sack of rice. He saw children everywhere. So many children, with those enormous eyes that belonged to the chronically starving, eyes that had seen too much and understood that the world was not a safe or kind place. And something in him cracked. Not broke entirely, not yet, but cracked enough that light could begin to seep in. They're just so hungry, he said, and the words came out strangled, barely above a whisper. All of them. They're just so damned hungry. Captain Thornton nodded slowly. Yes, sir. They are. And we can help. That's all we're doing here. Just helping people who need help. The silence that followed was profound. The Japanese women, though they couldn't understand all the English being spoken, understood perfectly the human drama unfolding before them. They understood that some barrier was being crossed, some battle being fought that had nothing to do with weapons. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice so quiet that only those closest could hear, he said, "Carry on, Captain. Carry on with the distribution." He turned and walked back toward the trucks, his shoulders slightly hunched, and nobody missed the fact that he raised one hand to his face, wiping at his eyes in a gesture that tried and failed to be subtle. The distribution continued, but the atmosphere had changed again, deepened somehow. The soldiers worked with even more gentleness, as if they had just witnessed something sacred and wanted to honor it. And then something remarkable began to happen. The Japanese women, who had been silent and passive, began to show small signs of responding. A few bowed deeply to the soldiers, who handed them food, a gesture of profound gratitude in Japanese culture. One elderly woman approached Sergeant Patterson and pressed something into his hand. A small origami crane folded from a scrap of paper, nearly falling apart but created with obvious care. "Thank you," she said in heavily accented English, one of perhaps 3 English phrases she knew. "Thank you." Patterson felt his throat tighten. He carefully tucked the crane into his breast pocket, next to his heart. "You're welcome." "Ma'am," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand but hoping his tone conveyed his meaning. Throughout the courtyard, similar small exchanges were multiplying. A British soldier named Thomas Chen, whose parents had emigrated from China to Liverpool, crouched down to a child's level and made funny faces until the little girl smiled for what might have been the first time in months. A Scottish corporal shared his own chocolate ration with a boy who reminded him of his nephew back home, at sea. Welsh private helped an elderly woman carry her supplies to the edge of the courtyard, supporting her elbow when she stumbled on broken stones. But there was one more confrontation to come. One more test of the fragile peace being built in that ruined courtyard. A Japanese man appeared at the edge of the distribution area, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic. Men had been notably absent from the relief effort, as most were either dead, imprisoned, or hiding in shame. But this man was different. He was perhaps 45, wearing the tattered remains of what had once been an officer's uniform, though the insignia had been removed. He walked with a pronounced limp and a cane, suggesting serious injury. His face was scarred, one eye covered with a patch. He approached the distribution tables not with the submission of the women, but with rigid, barely controlled fury. Several British soldiers instinctively tensed, hands moving toward sidearms. Captain Thornton raised a hand, signaling them to stand down, and walked forward to meet the man. The interpreter hurried to join them. The Japanese veteran spoke rapidly, his voice harsh and bitter. The interpreter translated. He says his name is Takeshi Yamamoto. He was a lieutenant in the Imperial Army. He says it is a disgrace that Japanese women must beg for food from their conquerors. He says this is humiliation beyond enduring. He says you should leave. That Japan will rebuild without your false charity. That accepting food from the enemy is accepting the death of Japanese honor. Captain Thornton listened carefully, studying the man before him. He saw the pain in Yamamoto's remaining eye. Pain that was physical and emotional and spiritual all at once. He saw a man who had lost a war, lost his country's pride, lost probably friends and comrades, lost his health, and was now watching his nation reduced to accepting help from the very people he had been trained to defeat. Tell him, Thornton said carefully, that I understand his pride. Tell him that I respect his service to his country, even though we were enemies. Tell him that there is no dishonor in feeding one's children. Tell him that the real disgrace would be watching children starve when help is offered, no matter where that help comes from. The interpreter translated, and Yamamoto's face contorted with emotion. He responded rapidly, almost shouting now, gesturing with his cane toward the women receiving food. The interpreter's face showed his discomfort as he translated. He says you don't understand. He says you British come here as if you're saints, as if you're better than us, but you're not. He says Britain colonized half the world and called it civilization. He says you starved millions in India and called it policy. He says you have no moral authority to judge Japan. No right to act as if you're rescuing us from our own evil. He says this is just another form of imperialism, more subtle but just as poisonous. The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, and it cut deep because it contained uncomfortable truth. Several British soldiers looked away, their earlier confidence shaken. The history of empire was complicated, built on both genuine civilization building and tremendous exploitation and suffering. Captain Thornton felt the weight of that history, felt the legitimacy of the anger being directed at him, but he also felt something else, something more immediate and undeniable. You're right, he said simply, and the interpreter looked shocked, as did Yamamoto. Tell him he's absolutely right that Britain's history is far from perfect. Tell him that we've done terrible things in the name of empire, things we should be ashamed of. Tell him I won't defend all of it because I can't. But tell him this. Thornton paused, choosing his words with immense care. Tell him that I'm not here representing the British Empire. I'm here as one human being helping other human beings. Tell him that I don't think we're better than anyone. I think we're all capable of great good and great evil. All of us. Every nation. Every person. Tell him that this isn't about judgment or moral superiority. It's about looking at hungry children and having food to give them. It's that simple and that complicated. Tell him that if the situation were reversed, if it were British children starving and he had food to share, I would hope he would share it regardless of our history. The interpreter translated. Speaking slowly and carefully, Yamamoto's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, confusion, anger fading into something more complex, more uncertain. He looked past Thornton at the distribution continuing behind him, at his countrywomen holding tins of food and bags of rice, at children already tearing into biscuits with desperate hunger. He watched one little boy offer half his biscuit to his younger sister, and something in that simple gesture of sibling love seemed to break through his defenses. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost broken. The interpreter translated, He says he hates that you're right. He says he hates that his country needs your help. He says he hates that he cannot feed his own people. He says he watched his unit die in New Guinea, starving in the jungle, and he couldn't save them. He says he came home to find his wife and daughter barely alive, and he has nothing to give them. He says your kindness is harder to bear than your cruelty would have been. Captain Thornton felt his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. This was the complexity of humanity distilled into one scarred, broken man standing before him. This was the reality that propaganda never captured. Former enemies recognizing their shared humanity in the worst possible circumstances. "Where is your family now?" Thornton asked gently. Yamamoto pointed with his cane toward a woman standing at the edge of the crowd, holding a young girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Both were painfully thin, watching the confrontation with obvious fear. Thornton walked past Yamamoto directly toward the woman and child. Yamamoto turned, his body tensing, preparing to protect them if needed. But Thornton simply approached the woman with the same gentle respect he had shown to everyone else that morning. He picked up one of the larger rice sacks, a tin of corned beef, a bag of powdered milk, and a precious chocolate bar. He carried them to the woman, and placed them carefully at her feet. Then he looked at the little girl. She stared back at him with huge, frightened eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph of his own daughter back in Scotland, a girl about the same age. He showed it to her, pointing to the picture and then to himself, trying to communicate the universal language of fatherhood. The little girl looked at the photograph, then up at him, and something shifted in her expression. She bowed, a tiny, formal bow. Captain Thornton bowed back with equal formality. Then he did something that would be remembered and retold for generations. He turned to Lieutenant Yamamoto and, with slow deliberation, brought his hand up in a crisp military salute. It was a gesture of profound respect, soldier to soldier, man to man, acknowledging service and sacrifice even across the divide of war. For a long moment, Yamamoto stood frozen, his remaining eye wide with shock. Then, slowly, leaning heavily on his cane, he straightened as much as his injuries would allow and returned the salute with as much precision as he could manage. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't defeat, it was recognition. Recognition that humanity transcended nationality, that honor could exist on both sides of a conflict, that the end of war didn't have to mean the perpetuation of hatred. When they both lowered their hands, Yamamoto spoke again. And this time his voice carried no anger, only exhausted, painful honesty. The interpreter translated, "He says he will accept your help, not for himself, but for his daughter. He says he cannot let his pride kill his child. He says he still doesn't know if he can forgive, but he can acknowledge kindness when he sees it. He says he hopes one day his daughter will live in a world where people don't have to choose between pride and survival.